Pirates faced a deadlier enemy than cannon fire: thirst. 50 men needed 1,500 gallons monthly, but seawater meant hallucinations, kidney damage, death. Leaky barrels bred parasites, citrus peels rotted into acidic swamp. How did they turn deadly salt water into liquid salvation? You might think pirates spent most of their time swinging from ropes, shouting, "Arr!" and hunting for buried treasure. But their biggest enemy wasn't rival crews or the Royal Navy. It was something way less exciting. Fresh, drinking water. Yeah, not exactly the stuff that makes for a swashbuckling legend, but try telling that to a pirate suffering from the absolute horror of drinking seawater. Let me tell you something pretty crazy about life at sea in the 1700s. No matter how fancy your ship or how many gold coins you had, if you ran out of clean water, you were basically signing up for a slow-motion nightmare of getting super thirsty, sick, and having a really unhappy crew. Picture this. In the golden age of piracy, a typical ship might hold about 50 men on board. Each man needed roughly 1 gallon of fresh water a day just to survive. And that adds up fast. 50 gallons daily minimum. And don't forget all the cooking and cleaning. So for a month-long voyage, you better have around 1,500 gallons of drinkable water stored neatly in 63-gallon barrels. Sounds simple, right? Well, hold on to your hats, because storing fresh water on a rocking wooden ship wasn't just tough. It was a nightmare wrapped in mold and gross stuff. Water barrels leaked. Rainwater collection was spotty at best, and the tropical sun turned stored water into a gross petri dish of all kinds of stomach-turning bacteria. Now here's the kicker. You might think pirates just toughed it out and drank seawater when they ran dry. Spoiler alert, that's a terrible idea. Drinking seawater, the stuff with about 3.5% salt content, is like pouring salt directly into your bloodstream. It makes you thirstier faster than a hangover ruins a good time. Pirates knew this from painful experience, because some of the early attempts to drink seawater ended in total disaster. Think seeing things that weren't there, kidney damage and death. Let's just say that a ship full of crazy, salt-poisoned pirates is what nightmares are made of, and probably not the fearsome band of fighters you imagine. So why didn't pirates just sail into ports more often to refill with fresh water? Because, well, a lot of the time they couldn't. Sometimes they were hiding from the Navy. Other times they were in the middle of the huge Atlantic with no land in sight for hundreds of miles. And even when they found islands, the water was often sucky, dirty, or full of creepy crawlies. Remember, cleaning water like we do today with special treatments or high-tech filters wasn't exactly in their toolbox. The idea of a portable water cleaner was as made up as a mermaid riding a sea turtle. Here's where it gets really interesting. Despite all these problems, pirates came up with some surprisingly clever tricks to turn their salty, nasty seawater into something drinkable, or at least not deadly. They literally had to reinvent water treatment on board with limited tools and a whole lot of trial and error. And trust me, the process was anything but pretty. They accidentally stumbled onto methods that make perfect sense scientifically, even if they couldn't explain the chemistry behind it. Think of it like their version of a water treatment plant cut down to pirate size with barrels, sunlight, and a dash of desperation. One of the first problems they faced was the barrels themselves. Old leaky barrels of water lying around on a ship don't just spill. They become a feast for bacteria. Pirates tried all sorts of fixes, including changing the wood, coating barrels with lime juice, and even lining them with pitch, a tar-like substance. But shiver me timbers, these attempts often went sideways. Lime juice sounded promising, but ended up making the water taste like a rotting lemon, which, believe it or not, was less gross than some other failed solutions. One terrible failure involved coating barrels inside with animal fat to seal leaks, which let in dirt, flies, and sometimes worse. Picture a crew already on edge having to gulp down water tasting like old bacon grease mixed with sand. Bad idea, really bad idea. Not only that, barrels played host to what they called the water curse, a thriving ecosystem of microscopic nastiness. This is where the modern gross-out moment arrives. Pirates unknowingly invited all sorts of parasites and bacteria into their drinking water, wiggling worm babies, invisible nasties that make your stomach twist. No wonder scurvy and stomach sickness ran wild. Cleaning barrels wasn't as simple as scrubbing with soap either. Fresh soap was scarce and harsh chemicals were unknown. Most ships resorted to scrubbing with sand or ashes. Effective? More like a half measure that had them crossing fingers and toes. When barrel storage was officially a no-go, pirates tried to get creative. A popular, though questionable, method was to collect rainwater directly in spare sails or makeshift catchers during storms. This at least gave them fresh water that hadn't been sitting in barrels. But storms are, as you might expect, hit or miss at best, and there's the problem. Collecting rainwater meant waiting, which pirates rarely had the luxury to do since they were either chasing prey or running from danger. Plus, sails weren't exactly waterproof materials designed for water collection. They were more like giant sponges likely to get contaminated themselves. Then came the very pirate-like move of just being resourceful. Some crews started using distillation, though not quite in the way you might imagine. They would boil seawater and try to capture the steam, turning it back into fresh water in makeshift setups. It was basic. Imagine holding tin cups or pans near the roof of a cabin while steam traveled to cooler surfaces. It's basically what modern water cleaning plants do, but on a laughably small scale. The major downer? This method was ridiculously time-consuming, slow, and needed fuel supplies that weren't easy to come by on a pirate ship stretched thin for supplies. Here's a juicy historical tidbit you don't hear often. Captain Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates in the early 1700s, reportedly ordered his crew to build a special distillation rig on board his ship, the Royal Fortune. It was basically a copper pot still jury-rigged above the galley stove. This setup could produce roughly 10 extra gallons of fresh water a day. A small amount compared to the 50 gallons the whole crew needed. But with a 70% survival improvement on long voyages, it was a game changer. Unfortunately, this rig was delicate and prone to leaks, fires, and explosion, often leading to panicked sailors dousing the whole thing with buckets of seawater. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation by putting out your own fire. Another clever trick pirates adopted was burying barrels in sand or covering them in wet cloths to keep the water cool and slow the growth of bacteria in warmer climates. Think of it as the 17th century version of a refrigerator. It wasn't exactly running your fridge at 35 degrees, but slowing down bacterial growth from tropical hot to lukewarm was good enough to keep more pirates from throwing up their dinners over the side. This method, oddly enough, also reduced the salty taste because the cooler temperature slightly decreased evaporation, stopping salt buildup from climbing. Not exactly high-tech, but given their limits, it was a tiny win. Of course, not every attempt was about clever engineering. Pirates also experimented with additives to mask or preserve water, which sometimes backfired spectacularly. An expedition off the coast of the Caribbean in 1719 recorded a failed attempt to flavor water barrels with rum and citrus peels, hoping it would stop spoilage and lift the crew's spirits. The idea sounded brilliant until the citrus peels rotted and foamed inside the barrels, turning the entire supply into a bubbly, slightly alcoholic, acidic swamp. The crew nicknamed it Pirate Punch, but not in a good way. Unsurprisingly, rum-flavored water wasn't the morale booster they hoped, and a good quarter of the crew ended up with upset stomachs, leaving the punch mysteriously absent at the next raid. So far, the water problems pirates faced weren't just minor annoyances. They were alive, breathing, and downright hostile enemies sabotaging every journey. Without real technology, every solution was a bit of a band-aid. A hope, a toss of the dice in the sprawling ocean casino. The stakes were high. Running out of water meant not just discomfort, but slow death, mutiny, and the end of any plans for treasure or glory. Up next, we'll dive into the real brilliance behind the pirates' freshwater breakthrough. The method so good it saved lives and helped pirates dominate the seas for decades. Spoiler, it involves sunlight, a dash of chemistry, and a bit of luck that would make even the saltiest sea dog grin. But for now, just imagine steaming seawater turning into fresh, drinkable magic, while pirates toasted their own survival with the world's oldest DIY water cleaning system. Keep that thought warm. It's coming up right after this. All right, now that we've seen pirates wrestling with leaky barrels, gross pirate punch, and rainy day sail sponges, here's where it gets really good. You remember Captain Bartholomew Roberts and his jury-rigged distillation rig? Turns out pirates weren't just flailing randomly. They accidentally stumbled onto the basics of desalination. Yes, desalination. The same tech that today powers some of the world's most expensive water plants to turn seawater into pure drinking water started as a bunch of swashbuckling tinkering on wooden ships. The real genius? Pirates basically invented the world's oldest solar still. Picture this, a shallow pan or barrel, seawater poured in with a glass cover or some clear material above it trapping the hot sunlight. The sun heats the salt water. It evaporates, leaving the nasty salt behind, and water droplets drip down the glass, collecting as fresh water. No sea worms, no swamp punch. It's basically Mother Nature doing all the hard work while pirates got to sip something closer to nectar of the gods. Pirates didn't know the science. We're talking the early 1700s here. No chemistry class. But their trial and error perfected a setup that was roughly 70 to 80% effective. Meaning for every 10 gallons of seawater, they got 7 to 8 gallons of usable drinking water. Not bad when you're stuck in the middle of the Atlantic. And it was surprisingly quick, too. In about 24 to 48 hours, a steady rig could supply a few gallons daily, enough to keep the crew from dying of thirst and mutiny on a 2-month voyage. Now, you might wonder how they knew to build these contraptions, since sunlight and evaporation aren't exactly obvious life-saving tools, unless you're a scientist or a super practical pirate. Well, it actually started with a mistake aboard the Royal Fortune, the very ship Bartholomew Roberts commanded. Legend has it the crew noticed water left in their cooking pot, covered by broken glass from a smashed window. Tasted way less salty than the seawater they'd been drinking. Pirates may have been experts at randomness, but sometimes randomness leads to lucky discoveries. They refined the design, experimenting with angled pans and even glass panels salvaged from broken skylights. These makeshift solar stills were fragile, but when they worked, crew morale skyrocketed, and reports from the time mentioned fewer cases of scorched throats or shriveled tongues. Pirates speak for dehydration. You can imagine the relief. Suddenly there was hope beyond the barrel swamp and rainy day catches. Funny enough, the solar stills also had unintended side effects. Because the water came out so pure, literally distilled, it was almost too pure. Pirates reportedly experienced mild headaches and dizziness because distilled water lacks minerals found naturally in drinking water. Kind of like switching from a balanced diet to just sugar water. Ancient journals from the Caribbean mention Captain Edward Lowe grumbling over ghost water that made the crew's breath taste weird and caused strange cravings for salty snacks. Pirate nutrition was already a disaster zone, so this just added to the chaos. But game-changing or not, these rigs turned fresh water from a mythical treasure into something reachable at sea. But hold your horses, or should I say parrots. Solar stills weren't the single magic bullet. Pirates had one more ace up their sleeves, planting fresh water around the ship using live algae and water plants that could naturally filter impurities. It sounds more like a science fair project than pirate survival. But floating gardens on rafts or in barrels shaped something closer to a living water filter. The algae ate waste, releasing oxygen and absorbing harmful chemicals. It's basically a pirate version of a biofilter, a method modern aquariums and water treatment plants use today. Captain Henry Morgan's crew was famously fond of this method when sailing close to tropical islands, sometimes taking the time to harvest mangrove roots or water moss. Though slow to work and requiring stable conditions, which pirates didn't usually have, it was a win against the parasite-infested swamp water resting in barrels. The catch? It was only practical when anchored near land and required constant maintenance to prevent the whole setup from smelling like a rotten seaweed pile. No wonder pirates preferred to abandon these projects during raids or storms. Now about that thirst-killing craving every pirate had. Rum. Here's a sparkling bit of irony. While alcohol can dehydrate you, rum was considered safer than questionable water. Pirates diluted rum with fresh water whenever possible to kill off some bacteria and make the water last longer. Kind of like a pirate-age hand sanitizer mix. It's about 25% proof rum on average, stronger than modern liquor but weaker than pure spirits. This mixture killed some germs but did little for parasites and didn't fix the fundamental salt problem. The real kicker? While rum helped morale and masked bad water taste, pirates developed rum ration rules so strict you'd think they were running a tightrope act. Too much rum and you're too drunk to fight or steer. Too little and you're miserable with possibly stomach sickness. You can probably guess how the naval officers looked down on these practical water enhancements. Still, piracy was full of crafty improvisation, like the infamous lime juice ration. Pirates didn't just carry barrels of sour liquid for laughs. The citrus actually slowed scurvy, a disease that was wiping out crews worldwide. It was almost too good to be true. Vitamin C fights anemia and gum disease, but also cleaned out barrels a little with its acidity, strangely lowering bacterial growth. You might say lime juice was a pirate's multi-tool fighting disease and making barrels less of a biohazard zone. That said, the taste was awful, often described as kissing a sour dog. But the alternative was dying a slow, miserable death. Sailors often mixed this sour juice with their rancid water or rum to help chug it down faster. One heck of a cocktail, if you ask me. Captain Woodes Rogers, sailing the Caribbean in 1719, was a fan of this practice, handing out lime rations on long voyages with documented improvements in crew effectiveness and morale. Piecing this all together, pirates created a kind of primitive but surprisingly sophisticated survival system. It wasn't perfect, far from it. But with distillation rigs, barrel innovations, water biofilters, and citrus vitamin juice, a pirate crew could survive twice as long without touching land. And remember, lifespan at sea wasn't measured in great adventures or buried treasure found, but in how many days the crew stayed hydrated enough not to keel over. Some historians credit pirate water innovations for enabling longer raids and deeper voyages into the Caribbean and Atlantic, effectively changing the game against colonial navies. It's not the stuff of flashy sword fights, but keeping the crew hydrated was the quiet backbone of piracy's golden age. Here's something to chew on. Despite their desperation and endless trial and error, pirates never figured out the last piece of the puzzle: mineral replacement. Drinking distilled or filtered water stripped of natural minerals like magnesium or calcium eventually caused problems. Modern sailors have sports drinks, electrolyte tablets, and sophisticated water hygiene practices. Pirates had seawater salt, rum, and hope, which means that even after mastering getting fresh water, many pirates were technically sipping liquid that was just as dangerous, just less obviously horrific. A reminder that even these salty sea dogs were fighting not just the sea, but nature and science, while trying to look tough. So next time you picture pirates with cutlasses and parrots, remember the real secret to their survival and success was keeping their throats wet with water so cleverly purified it was basically the 17th century version of a Tesla water purifier. All it took was a copper still, a spot of sun, and a crew willing to taste some sketchy science. Turns out the scariest thing at sea wasn't the Royal Navy or cursed treasure. It was the simple, relentless struggle against thirst and bad water. And in that fight, pirates were some of history's most inventive, if messy, engineers. Not exactly the legend of sword fights and gold, but way more important nonetheless.